Not all first class and no farming
Not all
pass.
first
I am
class
as
and no
always your
farming
host,
paths.
Christopher
I
Pollardale,
am as
MA,
always your
DMA.
host, Christopher
We are
Pollardale,
Duncanville High
MA,
School
DMA.
in these
We are
United
Duncanville
States,
High School
and today
in
is
these
November
United
17th,
States, and today
2020.
is November
And on this
17th,
date in history,
2020. And on
in
this date in history, in
1558, uh, Queen
1558,
Elizabeth took over for her sister
Queen
Bloody Mary
Elizabeth
when Bloody
took
Mary
over for her
died.
sister Bloody
Now, if you're
Mary when Bloody
wondering
Mary
about my
died.
hat that I'm
Now, if you're
wearing,
wondering about my
this is a
hat that I'm
traditional hat
wearing,
in
this
Kyrgyzstan.
is a
A friend of
traditional
mine
hat
was
in
a
Kyrgyzstan.
was a
A friend of
Rhodes
mine
a
was
Rhodes
a
scholar there and
Rhodes
got to teach in
a Rhodes
on a
scholar there
Fulbright
and got to
fellowship.
teach in
So,
on a Fulbright
you know,
fellowship. So,
it's really nice and
you know,
comfortable. It's
it's really nice
aerodynamic.
and
I went
comfortable.
jogging
It's
down the street and I was
aerodynamic.
like
I went jogging down the
three
street and I
minutes
was like
faster on my mile time. So
three
instead of
minutes
it taking me
faster on my mile
32
time. So
minutes to
instead
walk
of
a
it
mile, I
taking
did
me
it in
32
29.
minutes to walk a
Got a lot
mile,
of
I did it in
attention too.
29. Got a lot of attention too.
So now the part of the conversation everyone's been waiting for. This has to do with class. Okay? So the class system in Europe, you're divided up into a few different categories. One you have is nobility, and now this is 2 to 3% of all of Europe. Most of them live off of estates, so they don't really have any jobs. What they do is they rent out land and they make money off of that, and that's what pays for their lifestyles. They have almost all of the important positions in the military, in the government, judicial offices. Okay, the people from country to country really have much more in common with people from other countries than they do with the people that live within their own nations. Most of them spoke French because most of the Enlightenment was done in French. French becomes really the unofficial language of the nobility of France during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Okay. Uh, the men were very likely to go off and experience European art. Many of them would go on some type of trip all around Europe whenever they became adults before they got married, where they would go out, see different art in different cities. Uh, they would try prostitution in several different nations. They would read Enlightenment ideas. The people in this nobility really will almost never pay tax. Not just anyone in the country could hunt. The only people that were allowed to hunt were people in the nobility. If they did anything wrong, they didn't go to courts like anyone else. There were special courts just for the nobility. And they were able to buy some of the most current fashions and luxury items that most people in the rest of the world were not able to obtain. And most of the nobility still practiced primogeniture. So the firstborn son would inherit everything, and that was a practice that was also used quite a bit in the United States at the same time, and as late as the 1970s in some families, and some even later than that. Just speaking about from personal experience with that. So after absolutism falls and there's this push towards the Enlightenment, the nobility are going to get a lot more important positions within all of these different countries. Now, the biggest problem with the nobility was since their fortune was tied to rent that they would draw from their properties, their wealth wasn't expanding quite at the level of other classes within the kingdom, and so this would lead to several noble families marrying into the merchant classes, basically, marrying below themselves. But this was one way of adding wealth to some of these, you know, I'm not going to say better, but noble families. So wealthy people could buy their way into nobility. Now, the people during this time period paying most of the taxes were the peasants. And even though they would study and sometimes embrace some of the concepts of the Enlightenment, most of the philosophers were attacking this nobility. Now, in Poland, which the nobility held more power than kings or queens in Poland, in the Sejm, they had the power of life and death over their own serfs. So if their serfs did anything wrong, they could have them executed and no one could say anything about it. So about one third of the number of European noble houses would decline between 1750 and 1815. Now, the class system of peasants, this is 80 to 85% of Europeans. Now, many of them worked as peasants or serfs, but don't get the idea that everyone that was a peasant or serf was extremely poor. Some of these people would work their way into positions where they could make themselves a lot of money and eventually buy their way into these noble households. Now, some free peasants would own their own lands, and others would work on the land that belonged to a lord. And really, the peasants were the people that truly supported the church, although they wouldn't get all the benefits of supporting the church, and a lot of households were forced to pay up to one third of all their crops and tithes. But that'd be collected by the nobility, and the church would get about 10% of what they collected. So the nobility found ways to skim money off of everyone. Now, in peasant villages, these are really controlled by the peasants that live there. And the decisions that were made had to do with the customs and needs of the community. They took care of all the poor people, they paid for a schoolmaster, and they collected taxes. Now, in places like the Elbe River, the Iberian Peninsula, Eastern Europe, and that includes Poland, as I was saying, and in Russia, the nobility has much greater power over the peasants and the serfs. And life really, if you lived in that time, would not have looked a lot different between the 16th and the 18th centuries. Now, in the towns, there's another group called the bourgeoisie. Okay, now this attracts people in capital, manufacture, and trade. So this was a way for people to kind of work their way up, but they're still kind of in this lower class of people. Middle class people owned land in the countryside and lived off the rent and dues. So they're kind of a mini version of the nobility. And merchant oligarchies dominates the political and social life. And the wealthy merchants try to imitate the lifestyle of the nobility. They would try and buy some of the same stylish clothes worn by the nobility, and in many cases, they had a lot more money than the nobility. This group of bourgeoisie, because there was so much money in manufacture and trade and in industries. So, the bourgeoisie cities, they become really overwhelmed with poverty and crime. Because as the wealth increases to these groups, they're trying to buy land to be similar to the nobility, and this makes it so there's a lot less land available for the poor people. So, major poverty and crime in these cities. So the nation started to pass laws to put the poor to work in hospitals or workhouses. London had 1 million people like this, and these poorhouses and hospitals that they would send them to work in are going to attract migrants from the countryside who do not have land and who don't have food. And eventually this is going to lead to major problems with bread riots, and the government's going to start storing grain and dipping into areas where it had never dipped before. Now, in all truth, the majority of what they're trying to do is still take care of the nobility. Now, in this time period, there were 20 cities over 100,000 people, and this includes most of the European capitals. Now, the truth is, uh, if you're living in a city, it's nothing like living in a city in other time periods because you still don't have strong sewage systems set up in the city. So often, especially the poor people, would be drinking very polluted water that could cause dysentery and other major problems. Now, patricians or other major leading members of towns or city councils were in charge of all of these cities, and there were really high death rates because of this and many other problems. The cities weren't ever prepared for having people like this, so a lot of shacks and shanty towns where a lot of people lived, and this is in addition to all the problems that they were having with sewage and polluted water. And most of these shacks and shanty towns were made out of really dry wood. They were always on the verge of a major fire burning down major sections of town. Now, in places like Venice, they had a licensed begging population, so certain people were allowed to beg in the city. So in Venice, they had about 3 to 5% of the population that were licensed to beg, and another 13 to 15% that were begging. Many people in poverty would resort to things like prostitution. And in France, they started going around and putting all the vagrants and beggars in jail. Now, aristocracy in the country house. Okay? So many of the aristocrats are going to stay on their country estates and avoid court life. So they didn't have to deal with some of the poor people. Okay? The Hanovers, these are George 1, 2, and 3. They didn't really have anything to do with upper class society, just the highest of the mobility. Now, architects like Andrea Palladio, he is a Venetian architect, and he starts building a lot of homes in the country. He builds a lot of palaces and churches, and everything for him is extremely important that it has symmetry and proportion. So, wants the house to look the same on both sides, have the same number of windows on both sides, and just have it so that it really looks the same. The Four Books of Architecture, which was written by Andrea Palladio, is one of the most widely read books on architecture that have ever been written, and it's still published today. So, if you want to look and see what architecture looked like to him, it's very, I don't know, that looks kind of bland to me. I mean, it's nice and it looks the same everywhere, but very, very bland and symmetrical. I don't know. I probably do everything like that too. So I'm bland and symmetrical also. Now, I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, aristocracy and the Grand Tour. Okay? Many of the sons of aristocrats are going to go on a tour of all the major cities. Okay? They're going to cross the English Channel if they're from England, or if they're not, they're going to go into London. They'll hit cities like Paris and Geneva. Rome was often there, Naples, Venice, Florence, all the important cities of Italy, Cologne, Brussels, Berlin, Vienna. So all the major cities they would go and they would visit, and they normally traveled with a large number of servants that would go with them. Going across the English Channel at this time was kind of dangerous, and there were pirates all over the coast of England, France, Spain, and throughout the Mediterranean. And sometimes you might get kidnapped, and they would have to do different things to. Sometimes they would kidnap people, and they would send back pieces of them, or important trinkets that they would have to prove that they were still alive or prove that they actually had them. Many German inns were very famous for having a large number of thieves and bedbugs. Bedbugs were really rampant throughout all of Europe, as were lice and rats that were everywhere. So even the nobility sometimes would be fighting with the large number of all of these, you know, problems that we don't see as much here in the United States now with bed bugs and fleas and rats. And Venice was very popular because they had very sophisticated prostitutes, that would be well read and would cater to the aristocracy that was coming into town. Family life, European marriages really were in the late 20s for men, and men would not get married until they were able to support themselves. Now, if you were to live during this time period and get someone pregnant, as long as a couple was married before the birth of a child, then it did not affect the inheritance rights of that child. But this is more of a problem with nobility. But a large number of illegitimate births were they exploded during this time, and this leads to a ridiculously high number of child abandonment and infanticide, where sometimes babies were left in the streets, put in the outskirts of town, sometimes just dropped into a nearby river or into storm drains, which we talked a little bit about the end of class last time. But in Paris alone, it was estimated at one point that nearly 1/3 of all the births would lead to infanticide, and almost half that number would lead to the abandonment of the child. So, not always the best place to be in Europe at that time. Now, I talked about primogeniture earlier, and just in case I didn't verify what this was, it's where the oldest son inherits everything or the largest share of the estate. In many cases, it would normally be something around 80% of everything would go to that son. And with Europe being as Catholic as it was, in some of these families, there might be, anywhere from 8 to 12 children. And that means that everyone else lives off of that little 20% mark. And, they're trying to marry everyone off to another family just to try and get rid of them out of the household and out of the purse of the eldest child or out of the parents. Okay, and really because of how high the tax rate was in Eastern Europe, sometimes you would have entire extended families living under one roof. So you might be living there with your grandparents, your great aunts and uncles, all of your parents and their brothers and sisters, sometimes on both sides. And you would have this estate that was just overrun with everyone in your family. So if you thought about having your own room, most likely what you did was had a small space on the floor to sleep on, or, depending on where you were in the cities, in some cases, the older kids would tend to sleep on the roofs of the houses. And that's because, on the ground in some of the areas, if they're sleeping outside, some of the methane gases given off by some of the urine and fecal matter would cause them to die of asphyxiation in their sleep, and they found the safest thing to do was sleep on the roof. So, not really the best of times. This is much more the worst of times. Cottage Industries came out during this time, and this is where a lot of people just worked out of their homes. So, a bunch of entrepreneurs would buy raw materials and they would send them out for rural workers to complete them in their home. So, this would give rural couples the opportunity to earn money without owning land, so you could do a lot of work from your house. And some businesses still do that. Hire out work piecemeal for people to take home and bring back in. Now, Richard Arkwright, he invents the power frame, and this is powered by a horse, and it makes cotton faster than spinning wheels. So instead of having to pedal everything by your foot, you had horses turning a large wheel, which would make it possible to spin wheels of cotton much, much faster, and make it possible for people to produce a lot more cotton. This is a time whenever there's a big explosion and a lot of innovation in the ways that things are made. Now, the agricultural revolution, and this is really headed by both Holland and England. So they started doing things like making sure that if you have animals and you're trying to breed them, that you only let the healthiest of your livestock to make more animals. And you did this continuously, generation after generation, kind of letting some of the weaker ones die off or selling them to impoverished families to try and make stronger herds. Charles Turnip Townsend starts coming up with ways to help out the soil. So he starts growing things like turnips, clover, and alfalfa, and this puts nitrogen back in the soil and also makes it possible for them to sell more food during times whenever they weren't able to plant. They also will use this and they'll feed it to livestock, and the manure would also help restore the soil. For those of you who like eating a lot of fresh vegetables, and particularly if you like mushrooms, a lot of that's grown in manure. So eat it, don't sniff it. Okay? Now, one of the most revolutionary things that were introduced to Europe over the centuries was the potato. And a potato could be planted in a small amount of land and yield so many potatoes that it could feed families sometimes for an entire year. Now, I know all of you are thinking, yeah, that's great, mashed potatoes and hash browns and French fries, but the truth was, in many cases, they would actually eat these raw. So I don't know how great that sounds. Jethro Tull, he starts soil aeration with a hoe and invents a seed drill, and this makes it possible to plant crops in land that they couldn't use before, like the Great Plains, and you just plant the seed down deep enough, and it would make it possible for you to grow in places you couldn't. Now, on the dark side, you have enclosure acts, and this makes it so that wealthy landowners could buy common land and make less land for everyone else to have available. The triangular trade, we've talked about this quite a bit, and this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about. This is an exchange of goods between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And they bring all types of spices from the East. Coffee, tea, and a lot of spices to cook with. And upper classes are also going to buy things like silks, calicos, muslins, chintzes, and this was another way for some of the wealthier people to get even wealthier. They would invest in some ships and get a large percentage of the profits. Sugar plantations, this is going to cause an explosion of slaves, particularly in Jamaica, where they had 600 slaves that went there alone between 1700 and 1786. And because of the introduction of all these goods from faraway lands like the Americas and Asia, there is a consumer revolution that calls for all these goods, particularly Asian goods. Now, Europe was really based on a market economy, and they become really dependent fast on entrepreneurs so that they're bringing money into the country, but also so that they can tax them. We talked earlier about how the middle class would, or the bourgeoisie would, join the aristocracy through marriage. And a lot of these expansions in this market economy are going to lead to rivalries that lead to the First World Wars, and Britain and France are going to be involved in a series of wars over the next 250 years trying to take control of global trade. So I hope everyone enjoyed this latest installment of information. I just thought I'd let everyone know that we just have one more lecture in this series before Thanksgiving, and so we're almost there. Just hold on, just a few more days. This is Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA, and I will see you on Thursday, at least in spirit.